Today is day 79 since Nancy Guthrie vanished, so it has now been almost 80 days since this 84-year-old woman literally just disappeared from her home in Tucson, Arizona. Some new information in this episode I'm getting into. First of all, remember the two ransom notes that came early on that went to the TV stations in Arizona? Those are the notes that we believe Savannah Guthrie was referencing when she said that she thought two of the notes were real and legitimate. Well, there was a Bitcoin account, and we've got some new information about a transaction in that Bitcoin account. I've spoken to several retired FBI profilers who have come up with a profile of who they believe is responsible for the Nancy Guthrie abduction based on the information that they have. And Steve is the perfect person because he has had investigations where he's used profilers before. I also wanted to see what he thought about some of what they're telling me. I wanted to ask you some questions about some of this new information that's come out in the Nancy Guthrie investigation and some of the information that I've learned from some of the profilers that I talked to. And I wanted to see, like, as an agent, how you would put that into action actually with the investigation. But the first thing I wanted to ask you about is this new information coming from Brianna Whitney, who's a reporter with the CBS station in Phoenix. And that's one of the stations that received the first two ransom letters, the ones that we believe Savannah was referencing when she said that she thought two were real. And they're now divulging, the station, that when they looked back into the Bitcoin wallet, there was activity on February 10th, and there's been no activity since. So this would have been a couple of months ago, right when the letters first came out. And a small amount of money was put into the account, along with a note that said, "We are ready to talk. Contact us." And then there was a link for how to reach out to them. And there's no way to know for sure that that was the FBI or Savannah Guthrie, but it seems like it would kind of make sense. What do you think it means that they put that note in there, but it seems there was no response?
Well, I don't think we know that there was no response. There was no response that was visible to us. But I think that what that is the FBI saying, if it was the FBI, which makes sense, it's them saying, "Hey, we're in a negotiation here. This is not something where we're going to play the game where you just dictate terms to us, because it's that whole thing. Well, this is your only mother. You want her back, so you better meet our terms." And they would say, "We're your only victims, so if you don't get money from us, you don't get a dime." So we're both in this, a zero-sum end game. I mean, this is big. And so there is wiggle room in negotiations. I can guarantee you, not every negotiation, but it really depends on how you do the negotiation. If you start, I know this sounds horrible, but it's like negotiating on a house or a car price, where if you come in and seem desperate, um, they will not budge. If they come in and seem truly, yes, we desperately want her back, but we're not going to set a precedent for future crimes, things like this, then you're forcing them into a negotiation. So I think what the FBI was telling them is, this is not a, you make a demand, we fulfill the demand. This is a negotiation, and this is going to be how it works.
Do you think that I mean, there was just that one entry from February 10th. Are you surprised they haven't tried again in terms of the FBI or the Guthries?
I I'm not, but again, I don't know what they know. Maybe I would be surprised. And in the FBI, um, in the same case, there's going to be a case agent, there's going to be a supervisor, there's going to be the supervisor's boss, the assistant special agent in charge, and then it goes all the way to the president in this case. So there could be, it would be astounding to me if there wasn't disagreement within them, within the team, on what the best strategy is going forward. And I've never been in a situation where there wasn't. Somebody saying, they sound crazy. Just pay them. What do we got to lose? Well, we've got to lose everything on this case and the victim and a precedent set for other cases. And so both sides come with strong arguments.
How much do you think they're consulting the family in the decision of whether to reach out again?
They're going to consult them before every significant move, and a lot of insignificant moves. But they won't be in, the Guthries won't be in the squad bay or the FBI conference room when they determine what their strategy recommendations are going to be. And certainly, I mean, think of it this way. It is not this relationship, but it has some similarities to a person who is on trial and they have an attorney. That attorney is an expert in the law, and they've seen this type of case so many times. But if the defendant wants to plead guilty, you can't talk him out of it. I mean, I'm sure you could try, but ultimately, the decision is going to rest with the defendant. And in the FBI, it's very clear when you're going through training and when you start working these types of cases that you are working as an adjunct to the victims. You are trying to help them. At the same time, you are trying to capture the kidnapper. And so it comes down to what's more important, capturing the kidnapper or getting the victim back. And that's where the rub comes in, usually. I used to argue that there's no difference. If you get the victim, you get the kid.
If you catch the suspect, you find the victim, assuming they are alive. Now, consider the Guthrie family perspective. From what our sources indicate, there is no significant movement happening behind the scenes for the Guthrie family right now. They are making zero progress. They have no identity for the person who took Nancy or the case specifics. This Bitcoin wallet might be their only lead. Savannah fully believes those ransom letters are the real deal. I honestly do not know if I could resist that psychological pressure if it was my own mother in danger. You would be desperate to access that Bitcoin account. You would stay up every single night. You would say forget it and dump more money in just to see if anything happens. Some argue this puts you at a disadvantage. If the suspect had Nancy alive, they should contact the FBI. If the kidnappers were truly open to a deal, they would have responded to the very first contact attempt. Of course, that does not mean they ignored it. The real issue is the bad faith negotiation. These people demanding the ransom were operating in bad faith from the very first day. They refused to provide any proof of life. They ignored Nancy's safety according to crime scene evidence. Every move they made was deceptive. It is like negotiating with a hostile regime like Iran. They might promise to act, but you cannot trust them because they have zero integrity. They have never shown good faith during this investigation. One major red flag is the public nature. They have never demonstrated any integrity or good faith. They have been deceptive throughout this entire missing persons case. One of the main issues is their lack of seriousness. They wanted the ransom negotiations to be entirely public. They acted non-serious by demanding that these negotiations remain entirely public. They wanted to use media outlets like TMZ or national TV networks for the handoff. They wanted this case to stay public. They wanted the attention of the media and the community at large. Day 79. That is how long Nancy Guthrie has been gone. No phone calls and no sightings. There was no proof she was still alive. Just when the case went cold, a new lead appeared. It was not a phone call or a physical letter. It arrived inside a secure and anonymous Bitcoin wallet address. A single line appeared. We are ready to talk. What the investigators did next caused the trail to go silent. Nancy did not just disappear. The 84-year-old woman vanished from her home in Tucson, Arizona. There were no signs of a struggle, no clear entry point, no exit. She was simply gone that day. By day 79, the community stopped asking where she was. They asked if she was ever returning. Then, the ransom letters surfaced. 2 were sent to TV stations. According to sources, those letters were not ignored. Authorities took them seriously. In fact, they were credible enough that an unusual investigative step was taken next. Investigators traced the letters to a Bitcoin wallet. This was not a typical demand for a kidnapping case. No direct contact occurred. No private negotiation existed. Everything was happening in public. Then on February 10th, there was a shift. There was movement. A tiny transaction, not for ransom, but to transmit a message. We are ready to talk. No official has confirmed the source of that specific message, though experts suspect it came from the FBI. If it was the authorities, this means the case moved from a simple ransom demand into a formal federal negotiation. This was no longer just a ransom. It was the beginning of a high-stakes and dangerous negotiation. Understand this. When the FBI assumes command of a case, they don't merely react, they seize absolute control over every single communication. One veteran agent framed it clearly. This isn't a scenario where captors issue demands and the victim's family simply bows to them. It evolves into a high-stakes power struggle and a clinical psychological game. The exact second you telegraph desperation, you lose. In these high-pressure environments, desperation is fatal. You have to analyze the entire situation from both opposing sides. Legitimate kidnappers operate under the assumption of leverage. They believe your need for her return ensures your total unquestioning compliance. Federal agents view it through a colder lens. Their strategy is simple. If the captors refuse to cooperate, they never receive payment. Suddenly, the standoff morphs into a static deadlock, a zero-sum game where neither side initiates a move and nobody retreats. Yet, one specific detail triggered deep unease among investigators after that initial message. Nothing followed. There was zero reply. No counterproposal arrived, no definitive proof of life was offered, and all communication ceased entirely. There was only silence. In a high-stakes abduction, silence is an ominous indicator. Now, consider the psychological state of Nancy Guthrie's family. You lie awake every night, paralyzed by thoughts of her survival, her terror, and the physical pain she might be enduring. You picture her waiting for a rescue that hasn't come, knowing there is a technical channel available to reach her captors. That Bitcoin wallet is a single thread of hope, a digital communication channel. The choice is brutal. Do you wait or act? Driven by raw emotion, most families would surrender everything, transferring funds or bombarding the captors with messages to force a response. The FBI operates without emotion, prioritizing cold strategy over panic. According to tactical experts, there is a very specific reason why. They purposefully avoided engaging with that digital wallet early on because certain elements of this case simply failed to align. Professional abductors are motivated by a singular objective: liquid capital. To secure that payout, they must satisfy one basic forensic requirement. They have to provide proof of life. In Nancy's case, that proof never materialized. No photographs, no video, no audio recordings, nothing. This absence suggests a darker reality. What if ransom was never the primary objective? As investigators dug into the digital forensics, they identified a disturbing pattern in how the ransom demands were structured and how those messages were electronically transmitted. The deliberate choice to make these details public contradicted established kidnapping protocols. The behavior didn't fit the profile, not even close. Right then, the investigation pivoted. The focus shifted away from financial gain and toward a much more localized and personal threat. The narrative moved towards something intimate and significantly more dangerous. The second investigators stopped viewing that ransom demand as the core. Once they de-emphasized the ransom, the entire investigation changed. Until then, the case narrative was built on a flawed foundation. That assumption was that Nancy Guthrie was abducted for profit, involving a calculated plan, a formal demand, and a coming negotiation. That was the expectation. But as the ransom theory crumbled, a different reality entered the frame. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't the Bitcoin wallet, it was the individual. If profit wasn't the motive, the question became, how do you negotiate with this? The inquiry turned toward an uncomfortable truth. Who would commit this act, and why? That is when the behavioral profilers took over. These weren't Hollywood characters making theatrical guesses. These were forensic analysts who refused to build cases based on imagination or theories. They rely on established patterns, decades of empirical data, and thousands of historical cases involving repetitive criminal behaviors. These analysts identify markers that the average person overlooks. Their primary focus wasn't even the physical evidence at the crime scene. Instead, they analyzed a specific statistic that initially appeared to have zero direct connection to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. Yet, upon closer examination, this figure becomes impossible to dismiss. That number is 92%. 92%. That is the statistical reality of women who are murdered by someone within their own social circle. It isn't a random stranger or an anonymous attacker. It is someone familiar, someone who had crossed her path before, someone from her past. At that specific phase, investigators had not even officially confirmed that Nancy had been murdered. On paper, she was a missing person. However, these incidents never occur in isolation. They are governed by historical criminal patterns. When you analyze Nancy's disappearance through that lens, the evidence begins to point toward a very specific and disturbing direction. It is a conclusion you cannot ignore. If those statistics apply here, then the individual responsible for her abduction wasn't random. They didn't just drift through Tucson and select a house at random. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. They knew her. Perhaps they weren't in her inner circle or someone who triggered immediate red flags, but they knew enough. They knew her address, they understood her daily routine, they felt a dangerous level of confidence entering her private living space. They removed her without meeting immediate resistance. This revelation shifts the entire scope of the investigation from external to internal. Law enforcement must now scrutinize her personal history and every individual who ever had a motive to watch her. Anyone who had ever taken notice of her. Unfortunately, in a city like this, that list is extensive. The list is far longer than most realize because when you hear someone she knew, your brain defaults to the obvious suspects. Family, friends, and neighbors are the standard, but profilers view it differently since known associates can include virtually anyone. It might be a contractor from a 5-year-old home renovation or a delivery driver who memorized her daily routine. A repair technician or just a clerk at the grocery store she frequented every single week. Anyone who saw her twice and took notice fits the profile, and here is the brutal, uncomfortable truth. Most people forget the faces they pass in public, but those watching from the shadows remember every single detail. Detectives shifted their focus from motive to access, asking not who wanted her dead, but who knew enough to strike. That was when the investigative timeline expanded from days or weeks into a stalking period lasting several years. If this abduction was neither impulsive nor random, then the offender had likely been monitoring her for a long time. The perpetrator spent months learning her patterns and waiting for an opening, a realization that fundamentally changes the case. A random act of violence is chaotic and unpredictable, whereas a targeted kidnapping feels cold and deliberate. Deliberation implies a specific motive, leading forensic profilers to focus strictly on the offender's behavioral patterns. They analyze the how rather than the what, because an unidentified suspect's actions always reveal their underlying psychology. Their methodology screamed one specific trait: unafraid, not cautious, not hesitant, but completely emboldened by the situation. They weren't acting out of desperation. Consider the logistics of dragging an 84-year-old woman from her private residence. The risk of exposure was massive, and the chance of a critical failure was high. Yet the offender showed zero concern for detection, moving with the cold efficiency of a seasoned professional. That level of confidence suggests something specific. They were absolutely certain they would never be identified or caught. Arrogance like that is never unearned. It typically stems from a history of prior success or a deep-seated obsession. Prior experience implies they have done this before and fully understood the tactical risks involved. They are experts at forensic countermeasures and maintaining total psychological control over their victims. Obsession is different. It is deeply emotional, personal, and far more dangerous. Fixation completely overrides the survival instinct, making the objective far more vital to the offender than any potential legal consequences. As investigators viewed Nancy's disappearance through that specific forensic lens, the entire narrative began to shift. Suddenly, the ransom demand seemed more than suspicious. It felt fundamentally out of place within the crime scene. Evidence suggested the demand was manufactured afterward to serve as a tactical distraction for the authorities. Coupled with the public messages and a total lack of proof of life, the entire situation begins to feel incredibly grim. Post-contact silence suggests this was never a failed kidnapping, but a project that was never meant to succeed. This leads to a question detectives were terrified to vocalize: what if the ransom was a total fabrication? What if the money was irrelevant and the demand existed solely to stage the crime scene as a typical kidnapping? If the ransom was fake, the perpetrator wasn't looking for a payout, they were looking to mislead the investigation. We are dealing with a much higher level of offender, someone who thinks several steps ahead of police. They possess a sophisticated understanding of forensic procedures and know exactly what law enforcement expects to find. By intentionally subverting expectations, they demonstrate a rare level of situational awareness and meticulous pre-operational planning. It points to a high intelligence quotient, indicating someone who is actively constructing a false narrative for detectives. The complexity of the case doubles because investigators are no longer just chasing a suspect, they are hunting a manipulator. They are grappling with a master of deception, which means every piece of physical evidence must be scrutinized. Every lead is now suspect, including the obvious facts, because they likely aren't what they appear to be. That was the reality here. Consider the widely held theory that Nancy actually knew her primary abductor. On the surface, it works. Statistically and behaviorally, the theory seems to hold water. However, the execution of the crime tells a different story, one of extreme boldness and total lack of hesitation. Ask yourself this: would someone in her inner circle really exhibit that level of cold-blooded confidence? Wouldn't they be more cautious, terrified of being recognized, and desperate to avoid any connection to the victim? Personal acquaintances face a much higher risk of identification, leaving a paper trail that leads straight back to them. They are easily traced through digital or physical connections unless they truly believe they are above the law. Arrogance only persists if the subject believes they are sufficiently insulated, intellectually superior, or simply too invisible to ever draw law enforcement suspicion. When suspicion remains non-existent, detectives are forced to expand their forensic scope, entertaining the possibility that the perpetrator wasn't family at all. Perhaps the offender didn't exist within her inner circle or close friendships, but operated instead from the fringes of her social reality. This profile suggests an individual with tactical access but zero emotional attachment, a watcher capable of monitoring her daily life while remaining entirely detached. Subjects like these are notoriously difficult to track because they lack distinct signatures and rarely frequent locations that would trigger police interest. They remain submerged in the background until a crisis erupts, at which point their proximity becomes the only logical piece of the puzzle. Yet that theory hits a dead end because it fails to address a critical forensic question. If money wasn't the objective, what was the motive? Why forcibly remove her from her home? Why commit this level of operational energy for such an unclear objective? Senior investigators noted that if physical harm was the primary goal, there were significantly more efficient and less risky ways to execute it. Simpler, more direct methods exist that avoid the logistical nightmare of fabricating an elaborate and high-stakes ransom scenario. Why choose this specific methodology? This tactical approach remains the single most critical question hanging over the entire missing persons investigation. Understanding motive is essential because it reveals the subject's ultimate objective, and identifying that objective leads directly to the perpetrator's identity. A criminal profiler then introduced a specific psychological concept that fundamentally shifted the entire focus of the investigation. The core question isn't how or why, but who ultimately benefits, because every criminal act produces some form of tangible or psychological gain. Even if the gain isn't obvious or strictly financial, a specific benefit always drives the perpetrator's decision-making process. Pinpointing exactly who stands to benefit brings investigators much closer to the actual truth. Investigators began analyzing Nancy's disappearance through a new lens, no longer treating the abduction as an isolated or random criminal event. They evaluated the crime based on its fallout, searching for an individual whose life was fundamentally altered by her sudden absence. This was the moment the file ceased to be a simple, missing person search and transformed into something far more complex. Following the trail of who benefited leads directly to the motive, and once the motive is clear, the logic finally becomes apparent. The confusion begins to clear, yet one vital piece of evidence still remained missing from the forensic reconstruction. One specific element contradicted every working theory: the highly unusual manner in which the ransom demand was actually delivered and managed. Even if the demand was a complete fabrication or a tactical distraction, the execution of the delivery still failed to align with standard criminal behavior. This discrepancy was impossible for detectives to ignore, as the subject committed a fundamental error that seasoned professional criminals almost never make. They forced the situation into the public eye instead of maintaining operational security, bypassing private back channels, and surrendering all control over information flow. They intentionally pushed the narrative into the press, a decision that stands as the most revealing clue in the entire case. In actual ransom situations, secrecy is vital. Less attention is always better for the kidnapper. Silence allows for total situational control, yet this event was loud, highly visible, and appeared specifically engineered to attract maximum public scrutiny. When analyzing the broader pattern, this high level of visibility starts to feel very intentional. This wasn't a careless error or sloppy tradecraft. It was deliberate, which introduces a completely different investigative possibility. What if the media attention was the primary goal? What if the public nature of the ransom was the actual objective? If that hypothesis holds, then this investigation isn't strictly about a missing woman, it is about a specifically crafted message. Messages like these aren't random. They originate from individuals with a specific point to make or something to prove. In Chapter 3, the investigation pivots to explore these themes, moving directly into a profile of motive, revenge, and fixation. It explores a theory that fundamentally shifts the case. What if Nancy Guthrie was never the perpetrator's primary target? What if she was merely a tactical bridge used to reach another person? Once investigators began asking who stood to gain. One specific connection refused to fade from the forensic focus. The case wasn't about Nancy, it was about Savannah. This was the point where the focus shifted. Previously, every investigative resource had been centered on an 84-year-old victim, an 84-year-old woman who disappeared entirely, leaving behind only her typical routine and her undisturbed home environment. That was the initial starting point, but the deeper detectives dug, the more they realized Nancy likely wasn't the final destination. She was likely just the path, and if that theory is correct, the actual target was a different person entirely. It was someone with major public visibility, influence, and a face that everyone recognizes. Savannah Guthrie isn't just a daughter, she is a prominent and highly visible public figure. Being a public figure involves a level of risk that most ordinary people never have to experience. Exposure, the kind of relentless visibility that never truly goes away. Fame breeds a dangerous brand of admiration, drawing intense focus from total strangers you have never even encountered. These individuals develop a false sense of intimacy, though this one-way connection usually remains entirely benign and harmless. Most fans or passive viewers simply watch from afar before moving on, yet occasionally that distance begins to collapse. The interest shifts into a quiet, surgical focus, a slow-burn obsession that intensifies with every passing day and segment. When a fixation takes hold, the subject is no longer viewed casually, they become a primary target. They catalog movements and analyze speech patterns to construct a detailed, fabricated profile of their target's actual life. This mental image rarely reflects reality, fueled instead by raw emotion and perceived slights that were never actually uttered. Misinterpreted signals take root, and once that happens, it requires very little friction for that warped perspective to turn hostile. A single offhand remark or one misunderstood broadcast is often the only catalyst required for a total break. The perceived offense becomes deeply personal, allowing the toxic concept of retaliation to seep into their daily thought process. This isn't vengeance fueled by facts. It is a calculated strike born entirely from one-sided perception. To a mind this far gone, objective truth is irrelevant because their internal belief system has overridden reality. If they feel slighted, proof is unnecessary. They only require a physical target to absorb their mounting resentment. Detectives shifted their focus toward a new demographic, looking beyond those with a direct physical link to Nancy. They hunted for a person fixated on Savannah, someone who had tracked her career long enough to feel entitled and angry. When high-profile media figures are involved, a distinct pattern emerges, though such extreme escalations remain statistically rare. When it occurs, it follows a specific trajectory of mounting fixation, usually involving a barrage of digital and physical correspondence. While most interactions are benign, ignoring these communications can cause the underlying obsession to mutate into something far more severe. The connection evolves into an intense, personal grievance that carries a significant and lethal potential for violence. Identifying the threat is difficult because the vast majority of these individuals never actually transition from thought to action. They remain trapped in a cycle of observation and frustration, confined strictly to the walls of their imagination. Occasionally, a subject crosses the threshold into the physical world, and these strikes are almost never preceded by clear warnings. Externally, these individuals are invisible. They look like ordinary citizens and project no immediate signs of danger. They avoid behaviors that trigger red flags until the final escalation begins, and at that point, intervention is usually impossible. Police stopped asking who had physical access to Nancy and started questioning who had a psychological motive instead. They scrutinized Savannah's inbox for anyone claiming a deep emotional bond or those whose repeated messages displayed an alarming intensity. They prioritized anyone expressing deep-seated resentment because if this was an act of revenge, the motive was highly specific. It was a surgical strike, but obsession alone fails to account for the sophisticated and highly disciplined methods used here. A grudge explains the why, but it doesn't explain the logistics of the abduction. Taking Nancy was a complex operation. This wasn't an impulsive crime of passion or a sudden outburst of rage. This was something entirely different. Executing this required meticulous planning and situational awareness, proving the perpetrator was not merely reacting to a surge of emotion. They operated with tactical precision, and the fusion of raw emotional drive and cold strategy is a lethal combination. It confirms the suspect is not reactive, but highly deliberate, constantly anticipating the next move in this sequence. They are weighing every outcome and making careful, incremental decisions to maintain total control. When you layer that tactical discipline over a core of deep obsession, you are dealing with more than just motivation. You are facing total commitment, and that level of dedication forces investigators to reevaluate every piece of evidence. The ransom demands and the periods of calculated silence no longer seem like mistakes. They appear to be tools for control. Consider the mechanics of a high-profile case. The narrative spreads rapidly as media outlets amplify every single development. As the story expands, an individual seeking maximum exposure or a platform for their grievances would exploit this massive visibility. If the objective was to force a specific narrative into the national spotlight, they would achieve it by manufacturing an unignorable crisis. By transforming a private crime into a massive public spectacle, they ensure the eyes of the nation remain fixed on them. If visibility was the true endgame, then those ransom notes were never about currency, they were about securing an audience. They served as a mechanism to ensure the details of this story reached the widest possible demographic. More critically, the communications were designed to reach a very specific, intended recipient, Savannah herself. Because when the goal is to terrorize a public figure, the message is never delivered with a whisper. You engineer the act to ensure maximum visibility, leveraging the media as the most efficient conduit for mass exposure. However, the internal logic fractures at this point because even if public attention remained the primary objective, Even if the abduction served as a specific signal, a critical component remains absent, the core message itself. What was the motive? Currently, there are no tangible demands, no manifestos, and no context, only the violent act. Total silence followed, and that void communicates nothing unless the physical act of the crime was the intended statement. Perhaps taking Nancy was the entire point. If so, the subsequent events were irrelevant to the offender. The focus was solely on the completed action, suggesting a reality that investigators were hesitant to acknowledge immediately. Adopting that perspective shifts the case from a standard negotiation into the analysis of a raw, definitive statement. Such statements often lack any resolution, designed instead to exist as static events that remain permanently unanswered. They stay unresolved, and that grim possibility reclassifies the entire investigation into a much darker forensic category. The profile no longer suggests an individual motivated by external gain. You are hunting someone who sought to execute a plan and already succeeded. Even with that working theory, specific forensic details failed to align with the narrative. If the motivation was targeted revenge, psychological obsession, or a specific signal, the methodology remains inconsistent. Why introduce Bitcoin into the equation? Why establish a complex digital communication channel only to leave it completely dormant? Opening a door only to abandon it contradicts the behavior of a perpetrator seeking sustained public attention. Such actors do not vanish. They escalate their tactics and force their presence into the spotlight. This suggests a compartmentalized operation where the individual executing the crime was not the one dictating the underlying motive. A new hypothesis began to emerge, initially as a whisper, but it became undeniable once articulated by the team. The investigators considered a multi-person conspiracy rather than the actions of a lone offender. A coordinated group with distinct operational roles and varying degrees of criminal involvement. Professional hits often feature a clear disconnect between the strategic architect and the person performing the tactical execution. The strategist issues orders while the operative carries them out, a dynamic that often creates technical inconsistencies. The boots on the ground might not comprehend the broader objective, operating strictly on a need-to-know basis. This would account for the erratic behavioral choices and the failure to complete the ransom process. If an agent was contracted or coerced, their performance might deviate significantly from the mastermind's original intent. They might fumble the details or hesitate, potentially explaining the sudden and total breakdown in digital communication. It explains why the extortion stalled and everything reached a standstill, but that leads to complications. The scope of the inquiry widens significantly because the focus is no longer restricted to a single suspect. Police are hunting for a nexus between conspirators, a specific relationship that could facilitate such a targeted abduction. These clandestine associations are notoriously difficult to track because they rarely leave a conspicuous trail of evidence. The proof lives in unrecorded conversations and verbal agreements made deep within the shadows of the case. Detectives are forced to pivot back to behavioral analysis to bridge the gap. Even in complex conspiracies, certain behavioral patterns emerge that suggest the presence of a pre-existing script. Indicators suggested the difference between a lone actor and a subordinate, and this case offered subtle clues. These leads raised a vital question. Was this a solo operation, or was there a hidden architect? A puppet master with a specific grudge, a cryptic message, and a very clear end goal? If that holds true, Nancy's abduction isn't an isolated incident, but a component of a much larger scheme. A conspiracy that has yet to be exposed, pushing the investigation toward a sharp and dangerous new trajectory. While these theories were being constructed and questions were mounting, a critical development was happening in the background. One element remained missing: a piece of hard, physical evidence. A tangible discovery that moved beyond psychological interpretation and into the territory of forensic certainty. Every working hypothesis requires a foundation of physical proof to hold any weight in a courtroom. Information that can be laboratory tested and used to point toward a suspect without relying on pure speculation. That smoking gun eluded them for months until a single, Minute detail suddenly surfaced from the evidence files. Motive, behavior, and patterns. Detectives were quietly focused on a different angle. This didn't rely on guesswork or interpretation. It was purely forensic. A breakthrough that could completely shift the momentum of this homicide investigation. They recovered one single strand from the crime scene and sent it to a lab. Now, it was moving again. They utilized testing methods that weren't available years ago. Theories offer leads, but facts close files. Real evidence leads directly to answers. In Chapter 4, that is precisely where this investigation heads. We move past speculation and into surgical precision. If that strand contains what police suspect, everything changes. For the first time, this mystery is no longer about what happened, it is about who did it. For weeks, the police lived in a world of profiles, patterns, and endless theories. Leads were everywhere, but nothing stuck. When a cold case stalls in that void, it gets dangerous. The search drifts not from lack of effort, but because without physical proof, every path looks identical. Lacking physical evidence, every theory feels just as plausible as the next. When everything is possible, nothing is certain. The case was spiraling until the dynamic shifted, not in public and certainly not during a press conference. It did not make the headlines. It happened quietly. While observers obsessed over motive, the real work began. Detectives did what they do best. They returned to the source. They went back to the crime scene. They returned to Nancy's home, the last place she was alive. No matter how clean a room looks, no matter how carefully a killer plans, one thing remains unavoidable. You always leave something behind. It might be microscopic, it might be invisible to the eye, but it is there. That is enough. They scoured everything, the bed, the sheets, every single surface, and every dark corner of that room. If Nancy was snatched from her bedroom, then an intruder was definitely inside that space. And if an intruder was there, they left a trace unknowingly. Human beings are far from perfect. We shed hair, skin, and microscopic biological material everywhere we go. You do not even have to struggle. A fight is not required. Just existing in a room for moments ensures a part of you stays behind. That was the goal. Even the smallest forensic trace can become the biggest break in a murder case. Then it surfaced. No weapon, no fingerprints, but something far more minute. A single strand of hair. On its own, one hair looks like nothing. It is the type of debris you would just brush off. In a case like this, it means everything. That strand does not belong in that house. It belongs to a person. If it belongs to the suspect, it answers the one question that has haunted this entire investigation. Who was in that room? The strand was collected, bagged, and sent to the forensics lab for processing. Technicians used standard methods to see if they could link the sample to any known individual or criminal. Initial results were underwhelming. That is common, because biological samples like hair are notoriously difficult to test. Without the root or follicle containing nuclear DNA, the information you can extract is extremely limited. It provides general characteristics and possibilities, but it is far from a definitive identification of a suspect. In most older cold cases, this is where the trail would simply go cold. A promising lead that never quite delivers an answer, but this search did not end there. Something shifted. It became clear that investigators weren't finished with that single hair. They weren't satisfied. Believing there was more to find, they made the critical decision to ship it out. They sent the sample to the FBI lab in Quantico. That matters because Quantico signifies one thing. They are using advanced methods that go way beyond standard testing. This was high-level forensic science. They used experimental techniques that didn't exist years ago. That decision changed the entire face of the case. It shifts the tone of the investigation. It signals that police believe they have found the missing piece. They think this connects every dot. But here is the reality most people do not fully realize. DNA is not magic. It does not hand you a name instantly. It provides a direction. If there is a usable sample that hasn't been contaminated, it can finally be compared to others. If those conditions are met, detectives can run the profile against national databases. Detectives run the sample against known criminal profiles, searching for a forensic match. If they secure a hit, The investigation pivots from abstract theories to a physical person of interest. But without a direct hit, the situation complicates rapidly, forcing forensic teams to deal with unknown DNA and an arduous backward trace. They use genetic genealogy and distant partial matches to construct sprawling family trees, slowly narrowing the suspect's identity through genealogical connections rather than direct database hits. This process is grueling, but a success fundamentally alters the situation. This method provides more than a name. It delivers vital context, complex familial relationships, and a roadmap. Forensic background checks then reveal how this individual intersected with Nancy's timeline. In a high-stakes case like this, that specific data is exactly what the task force requires. Currently, every standing theory is built entirely on raw possibility, whereas DNA evidence is clinical and concrete. Science does not guess. It lacks the capacity to assume. It either makes the connection or it fails. That is why this strand is critical. If the sample links to someone with documented access to Nancy, a clear motive, and a matching psychological profile, the pieces finally lock into place. However, if the DNA points toward an outlier, totally detached from the current investigation, the entire narrative shifts, proving once again that the truth rarely follows the logical path we expect. This revelation makes the current moment a tipping point. For the first time, the team has a viable opportunity to transition from wild speculation into forensic reality, generating evidence that is beyond any logical debate. This proof does not rely on subjective interpretation, yet, despite this newfound hope, a heavy cloud of uncertainty remains because as powerful as DNA testing is, it frequently fails to deliver the specific answers investigators crave. Technical limitations and environmental variables often contaminate or complicate the final lab results, specifically regarding the hair's deposition. Was the sample fresh, or had it sat there for days, weeks, or longer? Detectives must determine if the transfer was direct or indirect. Hair travels easily, clinging to fabrics and migrating across locations without the actual donor ever stepping foot in the room. This implies that even a perfect forensic match triggers a secondary, more difficult question. What does it prove? Mere presence does not automatically equate to criminal involvement. Furthermore, involvement does not guarantee guilt. Even if this strand yields a name, it will not close the file alone. It simply unlocks a door. What the evidence collection team discovers behind that door is what truly matters. However, the context here changes the stakes. This is not just some random secondary crime scene location. This is Nancy's bedroom. It is the last place she was seen alive and the site of the struggle. If that hair sample is foreign and belongs to someone without a legitimate reason for being in that room, then it evolves from a clue into a major legal problem for whoever left that biological trace behind. This development carries immense weight because every lead up to this moment has been plagued by extreme uncertainty. This evidence has the potential to narrow the scope, transforming a broad investigation into a surgical, targeted manhunt. When that happens, the pace of the investigation accelerates and tactical decisions clarify. Pressure builds rapidly once you establish a solid direction. You do not just explore a lead, you hammer it. That is precisely what detectives are doing. While this physical evidence undergoes laboratory testing and the potential for a breakthrough looms closer, a major unresolved element remains. There is a detail that refuses to fit neatly into any existing theory. DNA might confirm a person's presence at the scene, but it cannot explain the underlying motivation for why. That motive remains just as opaque and complex as it was on day one. If the motive was rooted in revenge, a dark obsession, or sending a specific message, then the perpetrator is not a casual actor. They are someone who felt a drive strong enough to meticulously plan and execute this act before vanishing into total silence. That absolute lack of communication is what persists. Even now, following the initial message and the intense investigation, there is no escalation. There is only nothingness. This silence creates a suffocating tension because it suggests something finite and final, a mission that is now finished. This completion brings the cold case back to a dark realization that no investigator wants to face. The possibility is that whatever this act was meant to achieve, it already has. Nancy was never meant to return. Investigators are not ready to accept that. They will not stop until they exhaust every forensic possibility, follow every lead, and push every piece of evidence. That single strand is the strongest lead detectives possess, but forensic leads never exist in a vacuum. These links either solidify or they crumble, and if this connection holds, the clinical next step is to locate the subject. We must decode the relationship and resolve the core question that has defined this entire investigation since the start. Identify the perpetrator. However, another psychological layer remains, a forensic possibility that the task force hasn't fully scrutinized. What if the resolution isn't buried in the physical evidence, but rather found in something far more volatile? Something lab results can't quantify: the dark, unpredictable patterns of human behavior, tactical decisions, and catastrophic errors. Regardless of how meticulously an offender prepares, there is always a critical fracture point where a mistake occurs. That fracture is precisely where the search shifts now, moving from basic forensics toward the anatomy of error. If this individual committed even one tactical oversight, that single lapse could already be the key to their identification. No matter how clinical the planning of a homicide or abduction, a point of failure is inevitable. It doesn't require a massive blunder or an obvious slip most of the time. The undoing of a killer is subtle. A minor detail or a split-second decision that felt strategically sound at the time but lacks structural integrity. As the timeline extends, these minute inconsistencies gain weight, becoming the heavy anchors that eventually sink the suspect's story. When the broader evidence remains blurred, detectives focus on the outliers, and this specific case is plagued with them. From the opening moments, there were tactical choices that defied logic and failed to align with known criminal profiles. These actions contradicted the standard mechanics of an abduction, forcing investigators to reevaluate the perpetrator's true motive. It became increasingly clear that the offender wasn't just evading capture, they were actively attempting to manipulate public perception. Evading the law is one objective, but engineering the narrative is a much more complex and dangerous psychological game. This is exactly where the risk of error spikes, because controlling a false narrative requires constant, perfect calibration. You must provide enough detail to maintain a thin veneer of credibility without overextending until the entire fabrication collapses. In this investigation, that fragile balance shattered. Consider the ransom communications or the total lack of genuine negotiation. Looking at the timeline through a forensic lens, the interaction doesn't mirror the behavior of a professional kidnapper. Real extortionists don't leave room for doubt regarding their seriousness or the immediate threat to the victim's life. They don't leave dead air or go radio silent after establishing contact. Instead, they apply escalating pressure. They demand follow-up because their objective is singular: the payout. The most efficient route is maintaining high tension. They keep the family trapped in a psychological vice, constantly hammering home exactly what is at risk every second. But here, the pattern broke. A message, a single reply, and then absolute crushing silence. That void isn't just an anomaly, it's a forensic red flag that forces a pivot in the investigation. Was the person behind this ever intending to negotiate, or was the contact just a diversionary tactic? If the communication was merely a performance, then the failure isn't in their actions, but in their glaring omissions. They failed to follow through. In high-stakes criminal cases, inaction is often more revealing than action itself. This failure exposes the underlying intent and highlights the exact moment where the perpetrator's logic began to fracture. Identifying that specific point allows detectives to see where things went wrong or where the initial plan deviated. The reality is that even the most calculated criminal schemes rarely survive the friction of the real world. Unforeseen variables emerge. Stress compromises, judgment, and critical decisions must be made under extreme duress. This is the birthplace of the mistake. Regardless of preparation, no offender can account for every possible outcome. Signs of a derailed plan are everywhere: the missing proof of life and the sudden halt in all communication. The abrupt transition from active engagement to total radio silence indicates a massive breakdown in the original strategy. A moment where the sequence of events stalled, forcing the subject to react under intense psychological pressure. Some adapt, while others simply walk away from the scene and attempt to vanish entirely. They hope their initial actions were sufficient, but a clean disappearance is rarely achieved in modern forensics. When a suspect exits the frame, they leave a trail of evidence that continues to tell their story. Detectives will dissect every second of that timeline until the glaring inconsistencies become impossible for the suspect to hide. Several anomalies exist here, but the most reckless was the decision to drag the media into the investigation. That choice is high risk and tactically unsound, because once the public narrative takes hold, control is gone. As information spreads and narrative momentum builds, people begin linking disparate fragments, and once the public starts scrutinizing a case, it becomes impossible to contain, forcing detectives to confront a logical wall. Why risk such blatant exposure? Why would any perpetrator trade secrecy for the spotlight? Evading capture is the primary objective, but these tactics suggest a different motive, implying that simple escape was never the only goal. There was a secondary agenda requiring massive attention because high visibility fundamentally alters the mechanics of an investigation. It applies suffocating pressure on the police, the grieving family, and the curious public, turning a private situation into a global spectacle. That scrutiny forces suspects to react in ways they never planned. Reactions create tactical opportunities, but only if the subject remains fully engaged. You must weaponize that attention to maintain control, yet in this instance, the expected follow-through never materialized. The spotlight was fixed but abandoned, suggesting a catastrophic miscalculation or a sudden change. That shift is where detectives start looking for another failure, specifically the variables the subject ignored. Precise planning only survives while the environment remains predictable, falling apart when the situation moves outside that framework, forcing you to adapt, and most people simply crumble under that extreme pressure. Stress triggers fatal errors, exposing deep hesitation and the cognitive gaps that a clinical mind would never permit. Those psychological fractures leave evidence behind, and evidence eventually leads to a face. Traces are rarely just physical, appearing as behavioral shifts or digital footprints. Today, existing without leaving a trail of phone pings and private messages is nearly impossible. Location logs and encrypted interactions always leave something behind for the forensic teams. Some small oversight always breaks through, allowing the task force to pivot from the scene to the suspect. Assuming an error occurred, police look for deviations in established patterns and post-crime behavior that feels wrong. Normalcy is a lie after a violent act, and the psyche refuses to return to its original state. Even the most disciplined subjects adjust, oscillating between extreme caution and the reckless arrogance of thinking they won. Arrogance is a liability, proving far more dangerous than simple fear when the heat begins to rise. Believing you are untouchable leads to a fatal relaxation of the senses, where the suspect stops scanning the perimeter. Vigilance fades, and that is when the slips happen. A reckless comment, an incriminating search, or an illogical late-night trip. These minor anomalies coalesce into a trackable sequence, providing the leverage needed to break the case wide open. The timeline shifts to the aftermath, where investigators ask the most important question: who broke their own rhythm? Which individual suddenly transformed, acting out a series of movements that failed to align with their documented daily history? Behavioral deviations are never accidental. They are reactions to a very specific internal stimulus. Every change has a catalyst, and identifying that specific trigger is the only way to secure a conviction. There is a hidden layer here, involving the compounded risk of bringing in outside help. If this was a coordinated effort, the probability of a mistake increases exponentially because you can never truly control an accomplice. You are betting your life on someone else's silence and their ability to keep the story perfectly straight under interrogation. The more collaborators you add, the more unpredictable the entire operation becomes. Humans are weak, they talk when they shouldn't, and break when they face a cell. Deviations from the primary plan create tactical gaps, and those gaps are where the law enters. Arresting the main perpetrator is the goal, but flipping a witness is often easier. You just need one person who possesses a single piece of the puzzle without understanding how much it actually matters. Evidence is vital, but high-stakes cases live and die by the testimonies of those who notice something. Minor observations from neighbors become critical once they finally link to the broader investigative timeline. This is why the police department keeps pushing for tips even when the leads seem to dry up. Silence from the detectives does not indicate a cold case, it indicates deep focus. They are analyzing forensic data points that have not yet reached the evening news. Detectives are tracking leads outside of the public eye, waiting for the 1 second where every lie finally collapses. Sometimes the entire structure collapses due to one single, fatal inconsistency. One oversight, a single fragment of data that seems trivial until it becomes the center of everything. When that final gear clicks into place, it does not just answer a question, it reveals the entire structure. Yet this case carries a specific weight that defies logic, something that refuses to fit the profile of a simple error. Most mistakes generate friction and noise that lead to a trail, but here we only find a total vacuum. That total lack of follow-up points to a different conclusion. This was not a blunder, it was a cold decision, a calculated choice to terminate the operation and walk away, and that level of finality never happens without a tactical reason. Abandoning a mission after the logistical effort, the complex setup, and the high risk of exposure is a massive pivot. You do not just stop unless you are certain the job is done, unless the primary objective has already been met. That realization forces the investigation back toward a grim reality that no one wants to confront. If this was never about leverage, money, or long-term control, then the motive shifts into the dark. The goal may have been entirely different, something finalized in a single, terminal step with no need for further follow-up. A mission that required zero communication and only needed to be executed one time to be successful. If that holds true, the silence is not a failure, it is a feature of the plan. This perspective flips the board entirely because the question is no longer who slipped up, but who finished early. Was there ever supposed to be a second move? In the next phase, the forensic patterns begin to align perfectly. We examine the evidence and behavioral data, and when you analyze the full scope, the picture hardens. One theory begins to dominate the board, a single explanation that bridges every contradiction in the timeline. If this theory holds, the reality of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance is far more clinical and brutal than anyone realized. By the time detectives reached this stage, the case felt less like a hunt and more like a post-mortem. It felt like a sequence that had already concluded, a closed loop that had reached its final destination. What remained was not a negotiation or an active exchange. It was simply the fallout of a completed act. When you map the movements and the calculated silence, a distinct behavioral pattern starts to emerge from the data. It is faint at first, but the structure becomes undeniable the more you scrutinize the lack of action. At the center of that pattern lies one hard truth. This was never about leverage. This was about execution. Once the act was finished, the line went dead because the motive was satisfied. That is the final connector. In a legitimate kidnapping, there is movement and psychological pressure. There is a drive toward a specific payout. Demands intensify as the clock runs down. That is how these high-stakes scenarios play out. They do not just evaporate, they build toward a climax, but here, everything just flatlined without warning. It is as if the second half of the script was burned before it could even be written. This forced a new line of questioning. What if there was never supposed to be a phase 2? What if the ransom was a hollow gesture never meant to succeed? That perspective changes the entire landscape. The public messages, the lack of proof of life, and the abandoned contact point all start to look intentional. The silence does not signal a failed attempt. It signals a mission accomplished. The primary goal was hit, making everything that followed irrelevant to the perpetrator. This theory is not one investigators embrace lightly because it shifts the case into a darker category. It suggests Nancy was never being held for trade at all. She had been moved beyond the timeline of any negotiation into a space where no return was ever possible. If this holds, the ransom demand was not a goal, it was a smokescreen. A tactic designed to bleed time and distract detectives while the actual crime had already reached its terminal conclusion. This type of strategy is not impulsive, it is highly structured. It points to a mind that understands law enforcement tactics, someone who knows time is the enemy. The longer a case remains in this gray zone, the more the forensic trail begins to evaporate. Leads freeze. If you can push the timeline out far enough, you create a buffer, a tactical distance between the crime and the killer. That distance is the ultimate protection. That is the theory. But even with this clinical outlook, there are still jagged edges that do not fit. Regardless of how a scene appears on the surface, forensic analysis inevitably reveals deep-seated connections between the victim and the killer, individual responsible. This reality drags the focus back to that initial turning point, the undeniable link involving Savannah herself. Savannah. If Nancy wasn't the primary target, then her abduction must be interpreted through a far more complex framework, viewed through her ties to someone else, an individual whose life overlapped with hers and whose presence redefined the entire situation. Savannah fits that profile, not merely as a grieving daughter, but as a high-profile figure with a massive public footprint. Accessible in ways most people are not, this public visibility creates a high-risk factor that investigators cannot overlook. Ignore a massive field of potential risk. When a person lives their life in the public eye, boundaries vanish. They interact with more than just friends. They engage with total strangers they will never actually meet face to face. People who watch, listen, and construct obsessive psychological bonds that exist solely within their own distorted reality. For most, it ends. It stops there, but sometimes it escalates. Sometimes those perceived bonds morph into something far more volatile and intense, more personal and all-consuming. When that shift occurs, it triggers irrational behavior that defies standard human logic and reasoning. The core motivation isn't based in fact. It is fueled strictly by perception. And perception is a dangerous force. It is powerful enough to incite action and justify violence that seems utterly senseless. To an outside observer, if this was the catalyst, then the abduction wasn't random at all. It was highly calculated, directed not at Nancy herself, but at what she symbolized: a physical bridge to reach an entirely different person. A method to make a personal obsession undeniable. If this theory holds, then the following void of information is intentional. The subsequent silence isn't just absence, it's intention. Once the act is over, the message is clear. Message is sent. There is nothing left to communicate. This is where police face their most significant hurdle: challenge. Even if a theory explains the psychological motive and the operational structure of the crime, it remains incomplete. It fails to answer the most critical question of all: who? Theories can certainly provide a roadmap for an investigation. They narrow the suspect pool and identify a specific offender profile, but they do not identify a living, breathing suspect person. Without a name, the case remains cold, waiting for a breakthrough to bridge that evidentiary gap. This is where the focus returns to hard forensics, a single strand or fragment that transforms theory into absolute certainty, possibility into conviction. If that DNA leads to someone who matches the psychological profile, someone with a clear link and motive, then the speculation finally ends. It is no longer a hypothesis, it is reality. Once that identification happens, the pace of the investigation accelerates. In name, detectives do not hesitate. They move in, they secure the warrant, and begin building an airtight case. Connect every dot. They exhaust every lead stemming from that single identification. If the physical evidence and timeline hold firm, if the links are solid and the narrative matches the facts, the silence surrounding Nancy Guthrie will finally breaks. Until that moment, only one thing remains: the same haunting question that has lingered since day one. One that remains constant despite the changing theories. What truly happened to Nancy Guthrie? Because every logical theory leads somewhere, and every possibility points toward a suspect. But the cold truth resides in that dark space between them, waiting for a breakthrough, one piece of evidence, one clear detail that makes everything else click together and aligns the entire investigation. That moment has not arrived yet, but cold cases like this rarely stay unresolved forever. Not always. Even when the news cycle moves on and the investigation feels dormant, work continues. Something is moving. Behind the scenes, in forensics labs and case files, detectives are having private conversations, public. Sometimes the answer is already coalescing, fragment by fragment, just waiting for that final undeniable revelation. Moment, it becomes concrete. Until then, this investigation remains active and unfinished, an open wound for the family. Because somewhere, an individual knows exactly what transpired. Someone who was present at the scene, someone who made the lethal decisions that led to this tragedy. Whether it was a premeditated act or a personal eruption, that truth remains. When it eventually surfaces from the shadows, it will identify the killer and finally answer the deeper question why. In high-profile cases like this one, understanding the motive is about more than closure. It is about decoding a crime that defies all logic. All. That is what keeps this case active. Not just as a police file, but as a question that demands an answer, one that persists and refuses to fade, a question that will eventually be solved.